Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Welcome again to a much delayed session of reading through Northern Lights, specifically again through the sacrifice of Adele Wiseman. I am once more your host here, Pixel Broadside, otherwise known as the Pinoy Victoria. Welcome all to those who are returning. Thank you for coming back. For those who are new, well, this is another continuation, mostly of chapter 5 of the sacrifice, starting on page 61. So please get comfortable, sit back, relax, maybe brew yourselves a warm cup of tea as we proceed to the reading again of sacrifice. When Jane Knopp's youngest daughter finally married her boyfriend, who was not a doctor and not a rich man's son, but a good, hard-working boy, Chaim saw to it that Abraham and his wife were invited to the wedding supper, and that Isaac was invited to the dance afterward. His wife, whose heart was not in the marriage and who had put many obstacles in the way of the young couple, did not object very strenuously. There were people whose presence she considered more valuable, but as she had worked herself into an attitude of martyred acceptance of the whole affair, it was a small thing to accept also the presence of a family who, although they'd been 5 years in the country, she still considered immigrants, insofar as they still really hadn't arrived anywhere. They still lived in the little low-lying house with a bootlegger for a landlord. The husband was still the hired hand of a butcher, about whom not much could be said that was elevating, except that he knew how to make money. James sometimes said something about a partnership with this Avrom, but James was not one to carry a business through, she had discovered long ago. And their son was an ordinary worker in a factory. It was true that this son was a bit of a malumed on the side, but the few pupils that he had did not really make him a member of the teaching profession. What good did it do him to be clever, as James said he was, if he could not raise himself to be anything more than a laborer in a factory? Not that James' wife was in reality such an ill natured person. She was, as everybody knew, because she told him so in her definite way, clear headed and far sighted, unlike James. In the bad times, she had taken her full share of work and had, when the family was floundering because of James' total inability to calculate and look ahead, done more than her share in helping to steer it off the rocks. When her children grew up and were successful, she wanted to share fully in their success. She insisted on being invited to all the social functions her daughters and daughters in law held, until they finally managed to steer her to the older women's branches of the charitable organizations to which they belonged. Here she found herself a natural leader. She threw herself into charitable work. Indeed, since her children were rich, she could afford to feel more than charitable. She could feel philanthropic, and she brought with her an aura of philanthropy that lesser women couldn't quite muster. Presiding over a charitable society was really very much like presiding over a household that one's husband couldn't manage properly. One organized teas, one made decisions about benefits, one voiced opinions loudly enough to make the inadequacy of feebler opinions felt. Above all, one worked. No one could deny that Mrs. Knopp was a worker. It was not at all because of snobbery that she could not interest herself in forming a friendship with the butcher's wife. Really, if the woman were truly interested in getting to know people, she could always join one of the societies. She'd even sponsor her herself. But no, this did not seem to satisfy Chaim. What did satisfy Chaim even? He wanted her to come and sit and talk to this butcher's wife. But she didn't have time to hold the hand of every immigrant who had a story to tell. Jew hasn't a story. She had her own troubles too, and who would sit and listen to her if she put on a piteous face? No, she wasn't a sitter and talker. She was a doer. Let Chaim sit and talk. He hadn't done so much more all his life. Thank goodness Ralph was like her, a doer. When you came right down to it, it was selfish to sit on your own sorrows when there was so much to be done in the world. Isaac brought a girl to the dance and introduced her to his parents. He danced all the modern dances with her, but when there was a waltz, he surrendered her to his father and took his mother onto the floor. Abraham danced with the long movements of the old fashioned waltz, and the girl, whose name was Ruth, had a hard time fitting her steps to his. But she learned quickly and was not ungraceful, and she was healthy. When he took her as his partner for a shayar, while Isaac stayed out with Sarah, she romped through the long measures and was not nearly so tired as he when they finally collapsed, laughing, onto the chairs at the side of the hall. Chaim brought his children over at different times during the evening to introduce them to Abraham. They were all polite and spoke pleasantly. Chaim was very happy about the marriage because, to tell the truth, he liked his new son in law. You see, said Abraham to his wife, he's not ashamed to introduce his elevated children to his friend Avrom the butcher. We stand somewhere in this world yet. He had been very tempted when Chaim had introduced him to his son in law, the doctor, to talk to the doctor about medical matters. He had thought that perhaps he might mention to him that he himself had two arms that sometimes he could not think what to do with. True, he rubbed them every night with oil of wintergreen, but what good this did beyond making the room smell pleasant, he did not know. He would have liked to know, in a friendly way, what the doctors thought of such an ailment as his nowadays. But the doctor did not appear to be a young man who would invite a friendly discussion. After a few polite words, he was silent and stood off away, overlooking the people, with a look on his face as though his mind was elsewhere, as though he really did not think he had an equal among the crowd. Abram's eyes sought Isaac's figure among the dancers. The boy was enjoying himself. He executed the figures of the modern dance as though he had been born dancing them. An attractive little girl. It was good to see them laughing and dancing. The boy was at home altogether too much with his books, some of which, from the things he had come out with lately, were downright irreligious. This was the first time that he had introduced a girl to his parents. Of course, it didn't mean anything, and he, Avrom, was not going to be an old woman. But from the way she talked, she was an educated girl. A native, too. It was not often that native girls paid much attention to an immigrant boy, as though their parents hadn't been immigrants themselves. But Isaac didn't have to be ashamed in any company. He was such a man with this girl. Well, naturally, he was a man already. Look, the way he took her by the arm and led her to the refreshment stand. Sarah was laughing with pleasure. Abraham took her by the arm and led her to the refreshment stand. I had a feeling, Ruth told Isaac, that I'd like your parents. I always get feelings about things. Really? Asked Isaac. He looked down at her head of short black curls. She really was a remarkable girl. Polsky was not a malicious man, but he was unable to resist telling Abraham that he too had met Chaimnop's son Ralph, the manufacturer, socially. At the home of a friend, he said, they had spent a very pleasant evening, playing cards and having a friendly drink. He's certainly a shark at the cards, Polsky said with honest admiration, and quite an all-around boy at that. Abraham did not have to guess the name of Polsky's friend. Ever since her husband had been arrested and put away in prison, Laya's apartment had come to be known as a place of mixed delights. It was a place where men with money could come together, drink, and play poker all night, and where a willing hostess and her friends would help them to relax in any other manner that they might desire. Polsky's relationship with Laya had cooled into what was partially a business arrangement. Polsky was not averse to turning an extra dollar, and with liquor at a premium, he had undertaken to supply her soirees from secret channels of his own. Laya's husband was serving a sentence in the provincial prison. He was a craftsman in a respectable trade, but he had also stood watch in the middle of the night for a gang of thieves. When they were discovered, he had signaled the others in time for them to escape, but had himself been caught. In prison, he would say nothing, though it was well known that there were certain higher ups who were interested in the business, people who knew everything, and Mrs. Plopler was one of them, said that it was really a terrible shame. He was a good natured, harmless young man who had been driven into crime by the ambitions of his wife. Not that he wouldn't be well paid afterward for keeping his mouth shut. Thieves look after their own. Unless, of course, he was a greater fool than even Mrs. Plopler had imagined. That was as it might be. Abraham did not know the young man, but the shame was for shame. So this was his son, the manufacturer. It was a thing that might well bow his friend's head closer to the ground in his old age. Better that his Isaac should never become rich, never become a manufacturer and develop such tastes. A man with a family, too. But there did not seem to be much to fear from Isaac in that direction. It was the ideas he picked up, the books he read, and so stubborn about them. Who was the older anyway, himself or his son? Call his father old fashioned because he refused to believe that he was descended from a monkey. Abraham had heard that there were races in the world who worshipped animals, but to have his own son turn into a monkey worshipper in God's eyes was too much. And to have his own son tell him, furthermore, that he, Abraham, didn't understand what he was trying to say, that he was narrow minded, had been the crowning insult. He had threatened, heaven forbid, to throw Isaac and his atheistical books out of the house together. He had flown into such a rage. He was ashamed of it now, but a man comes home from a hard day at work to be told over the supper table that his grandfather was a monkey. Live Moishe, a monkey. How can he help being angry? For Sarah had begun to cry because they were arguing so violently. For her sake, he had decided to hear the boy out. Calmly and dispassionately, he would point out to him all the flaws in his argument. A young man, even if he is a thinker, is entitled to make a few mistakes when he is still young and over enthusiastic. So he had heard the boy out, and it turned out the whole thing was not so serious as he had at first made it out to be. Isaac, and this was probably the fault of the books, had not explained it properly. Of course, we are all the creatures of God. Now, the ape is the creature that, in his outward aspect, most resembles man. It was something that he himself had not thought much before. But when he came to consider it, it was true. Accordingly, in this sense, he was man's closest relative. Not really his ancestor, but this was, so to speak, an expression. What was there to make a fuss about? He had been happy that he had been able to straighten the whole thing out. This was the way to deal with him, not with an exhibition of temper, because, after all, he was a man already in his own right, but with patience and the thoughtful consideration of the things he said. He might perhaps let himself be carried away by some ridiculous ideas out of his youthful enthusiasm sometimes, but he was, nevertheless, an equal, and in many ways far more educated than his father. Avrom had afterward had an interesting conversation with Chaim on the subject of man's relationship to animals, and together they had discovered many similarities not only between man and the apes, but between man and many other creatures of God's world. Truly, the world was filled with many wonders, and what a thing was an education that helped you to see these wonders. Sometimes the things that Isaac had said made him long to throw himself into the books, to find the things the boy talked about. It was not enough to argue from what he himself, as a religious man, knew to be true. He wanted to be able to examine for himself these odd facts and theories that Isaac hinted at. How could the boy call him narrow minded when he would have liked so much to know? And that is it of this particular segment of chapter 5 of The Sacrifice. I started from a little bit in between page 61 and ended right at around the middle of page 65. So, thank you for during this little read through again of the sacrifice. I hope to start uploading again on a more regular schedule. It's been rough. Life has been rough, but you know, that's how life is sometimes. Anyway, if you liked what you've heard, please leave a like and subscribe. Drop by again, hopefully next week, for the continuation of chapter 5. And once more, take care of yourselves, okay? Again, this is Pixel Broadside, otherwise known as Pinoy in Victoria. Good afternoon, and you take care of yourselves, okay?